Welcome back to Wrong Sports. And when you think about the first things that happened in college football, what do you think about? Well, you mostly think about like the first bowl games, the first games on television. Yeah, I will be covering that in this new series of college football firsts. But in this first episode, I'm going to be covering the first indoor college football games. But when do you think the first indoor college football games were? You might be thinking the 1980s or maybe the 1960s if you know your history, because there was a bowl game that happened indoors in the 1960s. But no, actually the first indoor games happened over 130 years ago in the 1890s. And that is what I'll be going over in this first episode of College Football Firsts. But before I get to the first indoor college football games, make sure you go below and subscribe to the channel, and of course ring the bell for updates on brand new videos that will be coming out all throughout the rest of the college football season. And as always, you can check out my podcast. You can help out the channel on my Patreon, or you can follow me on social media. You can get all the links down below in the description. And of course, like and share this video with other college football fans. So when I was actually researching this video, I actually came across the first ever indoor college football games. Now, I thought the first indoor college football games actually happened in 1896, but no, the first one actually happened in 1890, and that's what I'm going to start with. This is an unknown indoor game that happened, mostly because the game was more of an exhibition. It wasn't really a regular season game. But the first indoor college football game actually happened in 1890 in New York City in Madison Square Garden. Now, this was I believe the second Madison Square Garden building. It's been rebuilt a couple of times, and this game came about due to the Staten Island Athletic Club, which was holding track and field events in the arena during a 2-day event, and on the second day, they wanted to have football and lacrosse games played. And according to the few newspaper articles that I could find about it, it didn't go all that well. For one, only 2,000 spectators showed up to see the football game. Next, the event took place in December, and this was decades before indoor heating was invented, so the original Madison Square Garden didn't really fend off any of the outside elements of New York City in the winter, so inside the big building, it was near freezing. In addition to that, due to the track and field events happening on the same floor, they had to switch the floor around, which took a little while. They needed to uproot, pretty much take out the entire track and field floor and put in a clay, dirt type of floor, which took them a little while. But when the football game did kick off, it featured a Yale squad, but it wasn't the starting Yale squad. No, this was mostly made up of backups, but they did have 5 starters from their 13-1 squad that year, including College Football Hall of Famer Pudge Huffelfinger. Meanwhile, their opponent was coached by another Yale legend and college football legend, an Amos Alonzo Stagg, who you will be hearing about again in this video, but he was getting his first head coaching job at what is now known as Springfield College. And the Springfield College football team just started their team in this year in 1890, so playing Yale was a big deal. And the main reason why this game happened was because of the fact that Stagg graduated from Yale just a few years ago, and he was the most popular and one of the best players to come out of Yale at that time. Obviously, this game happened before pictures and videos could be taken, so I do not have any pictures or videos of this game. I only have newspaper accounts, so I'm just going to be giving a short recap of what happened. The game was a close affair, which stunned a lot of people in attendance since Yale were the cream of the crop in all of athletics. But Stagg's squad would actually have a lead late into this game, but they would eventually lose it after Yale scored to win the game 16-10. This indoor game isn't talked about really at all, and it obviously took me a while to find out about it. And there really isn't any record of this game, mostly because Yale didn't play their regular squad. This was mostly their JV squad, so it doesn't count in their regular season standings. But even though this is the first indoor football game, the next few games that I'm going to be going over were actually given credit as the first ever indoor football games and covered more by the media too. But before I get to the first ever recorded indoor football games, I have to tell you about the venue where the games were being held, as they were played in the newly built Chicago Coliseum. The reason was because the Coliseum was huge at the time. It was 2 times the size of MSG in New York City, where the previous games were being held. And this is how massive the Chicago Coliseum was, as it was 300 feet by 700 feet. It was built with 2.5 million pounds of steel and 3 million pounds of lumber. Plus, to go along with that, the building had 12 massive arches to hold up the massive ceiling, which was more than double most buildings had at the time. When the Coliseum was built, it was immediately seen as the place to be in the growing city of Chicago. The building would also gain more fame as soon as it was built, it housed the 1896 Democratic National Convention, which drew upwards of 20,000 people, which was considered one of the largest conventions at the time, but that number is not confirmed. After drawing tons of people to the Coliseum for the Democratic National Convention in 1896, the building thought that they could draw for more big events, and they wanted different ones, not just festivals and conventions. They wanted sports, and one of the biggest sports that was happening right now was football. But most of the big football games were happening out east, with big East Coast teams. And since a lot of East Coast football teams were playing each other, they really didn't venture out west. So the Chicago Coliseum wanted to find the best teams from the West or the Midwest to face off against each other and find who was the best team out west. The Coliseum apparently had this idea going all the way back to the spring of 1896 because they started contacting teams as early as July 1896 to host a game there. And one of the biggest days for football then and now is Thanksgiving Day, as most, if not all, of the big games that were happening on the East Coast between big teams to find the best team out east was happening on Thanksgiving. And it just so happened that in 1896, the Chicago Coliseum would finalize a huge game for supremacy in the West between two big rivals, Michigan and Chicago. Along with that, they would also get another big game between a Western team and an Eastern team, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But with the Coliseum owners now having finalized their games, they would have to do the tough task of refitting an indoor stadium into a football field. And to do that, they first had to take away the floor, which was then covered in natural clay, and the clay would be sprinkled with water and packed down by a steamroller. Due to the length of the building, they were also able to erect stands on both sides and ends of the field. And to go along with that, there was balcony seating and gallery seating already in the arena, so the total seating capacity for the game could be around 14,000. Once the field was ready, the first game would be set on November 26, 1896, or Thanksgiving, and it pitted Michigan and Chicago. This was Michigan before Fielding Yost came to town, but the team still relied on offense to win games. Meanwhile, Chicago was coached by one of the most famous names in college football, Amos Alonzo Stagg. And Chicago was the exact opposite of Michigan because they used defense, and also their punter to move the ball down the field. This was before passing became a thing, so most teams had to use their running attacks to score and use long punts to gain better field positioning. When the game kicked off on Thanksgiving in 1896, it happened at 1:42 p.m. The game would be a bruising affair that saw Chicago upsetting Michigan 7-6 behind long punts that kept Michigan deep in their own territory. Along with that, the kicking game also got a majority of points, as Chicago's kicker hit a 40-yard drop kick for 5 points, because 5 points was how much field goals were worth at the time, and then clinched the win with a safety late in the game. The game was seen as sort of a disappointment since it wasn't a sellout, even though the indoor factor was seen as a huge incentive for fans since they didn't have to sit through the game in the brutal Chicago November weather. The attendance for the game was reported as 8,000, but other newspapers have it reported as 15,000. Obviously, there's no video of this game, so you can't really confirm it. The lighting was needed for this game because the building did feature natural lighting as they had big windows going all around, but they were quite opaque and dark, and with rain happening outside and cloudy weather, they had to use the lighting as the field was pretty dark by mid-afternoon. Now, this wasn't the first game with lighting, as the first game actually happened in 1892, but this was the first football game indoors that had lighting. The next indoor game was arranged for the Coliseum and would feature a contest between an Eastern squad, as the Carlisle Indians would play a Western team in the University of Wisconsin on December 19, 1896. And this game would be taking place at night to hopefully draw more fans during the holiday season, but it would also be taking place completely under electric lighting, so this was technically the first full game that happened indoors with lighting. Wisconsin was a top team in the West, and the Coliseum scheduled a team from the East in the Carlisle Indians to play them. I'm not sure why the Coliseum chose Wisconsin, but the reason why they chose Carlisle was for a few reasons. One was that they were making a name for themselves in the short time they had been playing football, as they had close losses to Harvard and Yale over the last 2 years. But the big reason why Carlisle was chosen for this game was because they took the money, as the Chicago Press Club made a $1,000 offer to Carlisle to come out to Chicago for the game. And since the Carlisle school was often underfunded, they took the money. And Carlisle took the money, and they also took it to Wisconsin throughout this game, as early in the second half, Wisconsin had an 8-6 lead. But from that point on, Wisconsin got really tired, and Carlisle would hit their second wind, allowing them to score twice and win the game 18-8. This was a huge win for the tiny Native American school in Carlisle, except the media and newspaper writers mostly gave them derogatory names in the game recaps of this game. But the 1896 games were shown to be good draws for the building. They weren't sellouts though, but they did draw a lot of people and a lot of attention. And because of that, the Coliseum would do it again in 1897. The field and the seating was the same, and the lights were used again, but this time the games were played within the same week instead of within a month or so. The first game was on November 20th, and it would feature Carlisle again, except they would be playing a new opponent in local college, University of Illinois. And once again, I'm not going to read the game story on this game or really show it because it's extremely awkward and racist towards the Carlisle team, but they would once again show that they were a really good team as they took it to Illinois throughout the entire game, winning 23-6, and this game would draw a few more fans as they got 10,000 fans for this game, and it's probably because they played a local team in University of Illinois instead of University of Wisconsin. The second game would be a rematch of the 1896 Thanksgiving game between Michigan and Chicago, and again, this game would be happening on Thanksgiving Day, except it would be happening on November 25th, 1897. And since this game was played during the day and they didn't have any bad weather, they didn't have to use the lighting through this game like the previous matchup. And this game would also be exciting like the previous matchup too, as Chicago would win the game 21-12 off of 3 field goals, which were all worth 5 points at the time, and allowed Chicago to win in front of 12,000 fans. But even though the second round of games drew more fans than the first round, the indoor games were scrutinized at the time because of the lights and the noise from the game. Yes, the noise was a big concern for people apparently at the time. The Chicago Coliseum officials weren't big on trying football again and again and again, mostly because it cost them a lot of money to change it to an indoor football playing surface. But the main reason why there wasn't any more indoor football at the Chicago Coliseum was because it burned down less than a month after that final game, as it burned down on December 24th, 1897, during a break for dinner during the Manufacturing Carnival and Winter Fair, due to faulty electrical wiring. The Chicago Coliseum only stood for about a year and a half, but it certainly had a lot of history in the building. A new Chicago Coliseum would be built in the next 2 years, but no more indoor football games would take place. After those Chicago indoor football games, an indoor football tournament would happen in 1902. It was called the World Series of Football, and this time it happened in New York City at another Madison Square Garden building, and there wouldn't be any college teams, as this would be mostly a semi-pro tournament. Also in the World Series of Football, the field was much smaller. That was due to the Madison Square Garden being smaller than the Coliseum. And this indoor football tournament only happened in 1902 and 1903 and didn't draw nearly the amount of fans that the worst drawing game at the Chicago Coliseum did. But thank you so much for checking out this College Football First on Wrong Sports, all about the first ever indoor football game. I will be having the first ever broadcasted game coming up, also the first ever bowl games and international college football games. That will be another series that will be coming up soon as well, so make sure as always you subscribe to the channel below and ring the bell so you can get updates on when those videos will be coming out. Of course, like this video and share this video with other college football fans, and as always you can help out my channel on my Patreon and my podcast and my social media. All the links are in the description below. Have a fantastic rest of your day.